So, originally this was going to be just one incredibly long video, but after doing a vote on Twitter, it was decided that I should break it up into multiple. It'll make it easier to watch, and it'll also mean a more steady flow of content for me. The goal this year is to really nail down a schedule and take the channel seriously, so without further ado, here's part 1 of a 10-part series on Kingdom Hearts. Yes, 10 parts, because I'm covering every Kingdom Hearts game. Well, except VCast, of course, because that's impossible. Now, I should warn you that these videos are going to vary in length. Some games I have a lot to say about, and others I can only type a few paragraphs on, so don't expect them all to be as long as this one. But before I dive into the critique of the first Kingdom Hearts, I think there's some important points I need to get out of the way. This retrospective is going to be laden with spoilers, but I will not be spoiling anything from Kingdom Hearts 3 until I get to the Kingdom Hearts 3 video. In fact, the majority of these scripts were written before I even played Kingdom Hearts 3, so it'll have been literally impossible for me to spoil that game. But none of the other games are off limits. Seriously, spoilers for every game before Kingdom Hearts 3 will be mentioned in just a couple of paragraphs. So, if you care about the story and haven't played most of these games, you may want to leave now. That said, I feel it's important for me to lay out my opinion of the series' overall story before we get anywhere near the critiques of the individual games. That way no one will be blindsided by the lack of focus I put on the stories on a game-to-game basis as we move through the rest of these videos. In my opinion, the story of Kingdom Hearts as a series is a ridiculous mess, and I'm going to point out why I feel that way now so it isn't a constant annoyance throughout the rest of these videos. Kingdom Hearts stars Sora, a character chosen by destiny to wield the incredibly powerful and incredibly rare weapon known as the Keyblade. Only we find out later that not only is the weapon not rare, but Sora wasn't actually chosen to wield it, his friend Riku was. But Riku was tainted by darkness, so the Keyblade jumped to Sora instead, because Sora's body is a vessel not just for his heart, but for Ventus's, whom lends Sora his Keyblade wielding abilities until he may or may not be returned to his own body. The darkness attempted Riku is tempered by Ansem, who isn't actually Ansem, but the heartless of a man named Xehanort, who was an apprentice to the real Ansem, who now goes by the name Diz. Xehanort has a nobody named Xemnas, but neither Xemnas or fake Ansem look like the real Xehanort because Xehanort took over the body of a boy named Terra beforehand. Terra, whom is a friend of Ventus, just so happens to be the one who gave Riku the power to wield the Keyblade in the first place. But Terranort isn't the only character whom has multiple versions of himself walking around. Sora also has a nobody named Roxas, whom looks like Ventus because of the previously mentioned heart thing. Before Ventus lost his heart, he had his darkness ripped from his body by Xehanort. Pre-Terra's body Xehanort, and this darkness became the physical manifestation known as Vanitas, which looks just like Sora but with an emo streak. If this weren't enough, a replica of Sora was created named Xion, who looks just like Sora's friend Kairi because memories. Did I forget to mention that Sora also had a recreation of himself completely made of data that lives inside a journal? Because that could be important, but so far it's not. Riku also has a data version of himself, as well as a dark replica, both of whom have strong ties to the character Naminé. Naminé just so happens to be the nobody of Kairi, who is Sora and Riku's friend, but also a princess. One of the 7 princesses of pure heart, whom if collected can be used to reveal Kingdom Hearts. And I guess that name drop is a good enough time as any to put a pause on this summary. But I'd like to remind those of you whom are defenders of the story that I haven't even begun discussing some important story aspects such as Organization 13 or the Disney worlds, not to mention important plot points involving memory manipulation, dream eaters, time travel, any of these people that I bet even a lot of diehard fans haven't heard of. Every single Deus Ex Machina plot thread and strange magical concept you could even imagine is shoved into this series at least one point. Complexity is not a bad thing in and of itself. The problem is Kingdom Hearts manages to be both complex and yet utterly shallow. It has the same basic writing philosophy as most Disney films, but with a Japanese shonen-esque flavor to it, which makes perfect sense. After all, that's how the series was basically pitched in the first place. Unfortunately, like most shonen, the longer the serialization goes on past its initial arc, the less interesting it ultimately becomes. The writers have to struggle to find more and more overpowered enemies and outlandish plot points just to try and keep things fresh, continuing to alienate new potential fans with layers upon layers of backstory bloat, while simultaneously beginning to frustrate older fans who remember when the stories were more self-contained, unique, and less ridiculously over the top. This inevitably leaves only one group of diehard fans around, those who take pride in understanding every intricate detail, having more fun putting the pieces together, and loving what remains in the story because of familiarity, as opposed to any sense of genuine quality. Perhaps I'm projecting just a little. As a fan of the Metal Gear series, I certainly understand the draw of Kingdom Hearts' complicated story. I'm not telling you not to enjoy what you enjoy, but I am saying that there's a subset of fans completely incapable of being critical of the things they love once they've delved too far into the fandom. If you happen to be one of those people and you've lasted this long through the video, then I'm shocked but thankful. You'll be happy to know that I won't be spending the rest of these videos nitpicking plot holes and retcons. When I do discuss the stories of the games later in this series, it'll be based more around whether or not the scene succeeded at being emotionally gripping, since it feels to me like that is the intention of the writing. Not to make a lore-heavy masterpiece with an extensive and satisfying continuity, but to string together a series of emotionally charged scenes primarily aimed at children and teenagers. And that's not an insult, by the way, to admit that you enjoy something that you're not the target demographic of. As a 26-year-old man, I am also not the target demographic, and yet I greatly enjoy these games. Just know that quality of the story, especially when it comes to the games that came out after Kingdom Hearts 2, will have little bearing on how I evaluate the overall quality of each title as a game. That's finally enough preamble. Let's get the ball rolling with a retrospective look at the original Kingdom Hearts. The general consensus regarding the first Kingdom Hearts seems to be that it was decent, but that it has since been outdone by many of its sequels. That it's still a good enough game, but it pales in comparison to future titles on almost every front. I do not fall into this consensus. Kingdom Hearts is a fantastic game, one that succeeds in ways that its sequels haven't even come close to replicating, and I think that mostly comes from a misunderstanding of how Kingdom Hearts was originally created. The game's design philosophies are more in line with Ratchet and Clank than they are other action RPGs of the console generation, and even most of those that have come after. Generally speaking, videos like mine tend to break the game up into sections, one on combat, one on level design, etc. But Kingdom Hearts is designed in such a way that all of these things are constantly being experienced by the player simultaneously. This means that as much as I'd like to organize a video more segmentedly, I really can't. It's a smooth integration of combat, platforming, exploration, and light puzzle solving that is the true magic of the first Kingdom Hearts, and the interplay of these systems means that they all affect one another. As such, this video will often slide into related topics, only to return to previous ones when they become relevant once again. I hope I managed to make these transitions at least somewhat smooth. Of course, I have my doubts it'll be nearly as smooth as the game's introductory level. Destiny Islands is one of the best opening levels in any video game. I could write an entire video on just this location since it acts both as a tutorial and a bonding experience, but since I'm trying to keep these videos at least remotely brief, I'll try and sum up the best points quickly. It does a decent job showing how close Sora, Riku, and Kairi are in a rather limited amount of time, and it gives enough incentive for the player to want to search for them throughout the rest of the game once that becomes the main focus of the story. But what's more impressive is that Destiny Islands lays out exactly what you can expect from the rest of the game in terms of gameplay. You're given the task immediately of scouring the island for supplies for your raft, which allows you opportunities to run, climb, and jump throughout the area to find them. The scavenger hunt is also repeated on day 2, but this time you're looking for food for your eventual journey. Here you are guaranteed to witness some of Sora's other innate abilities, since you have to swim in the ocean to catch fish and push this boulder to find a hidden mushroom. This is important because it lays out immediately that a huge focus of the game is going to be exploration, on searching your environment thoroughly to find items. Then there's the obstacle course race against Riku, something you are bound to lose your first few attempts, not just because it's difficult, but because the game basically cheats with the falling platform right at the beginning. At first, this really bothered me, but the more I thought about it, the more I think it works. It's showing the player that it's okay to fail in this game, that if you lose or get stuck somewhere, that it's okay to leave these parts of the game unfinished and to move on to something else. This idea of losing being acceptable is something I'll come back to towards the end of the video, but back on the subject of the race, I love the way it integrates itself into the story. If you lose to Riku, it cements Sora as the underdog, but if you're a returning player who beats Riku in the race, he shoots you a death glare, foreshadowing his own jealousy and the dark turn he'll make in the future. It's also interesting to note that combat on the islands is actually optional, and if you do choose to take part in it, it's fairly challenging. These optional fights act more like mini-bosses than regular enemies. Tina, Swaka, and Selphie alone aren't particularly difficult, but they do teach you how to fight different types of enemies. Waka forcing you to dodge or deflect long-range attacks before closing in, Selphie teaching you how to pay attention to sound cues,
You ready?
Tidus teaching that your attacks can be blocked and countered. A lot of people are going to lose in the fight against Riku the first few times. His recovery attack does a lot of damage, and it's going to take a lot of new players quite a while to realize that he counters with it after Sora hits him 4 times. And then there's the 3-on-1 fight against Tidus, Wakka, and Selphie, which is one of the most difficult combat scenarios in the entire game because of Sora's limited combat options. It's not a requirement that you beat these fights, but those who are dedicated enough to keep grinding away at them will be rewarded for their efforts with items, not to mention the reward of just becoming a much more skilled player. That about wraps up my short summary on Destiny Islands, but while we're on the subject of combat, I should note that it isn't nearly as flashy as in later entries, and at times it may even feel a bit restrictive. But there's a deliberateness to the combat that still makes it stand out all of these years later. A deliberateness that is often lost in future titles in favor of spectacle. The first Kingdom Hearts is still incredibly playable. In fact, I think that this combat system is still better than that of most other action RPGs, even some released today, which arguably speaks to how poorly designed most action RPGs are. A lot of games in the genre have limp-feeling attacks and repetitive action cycles that don't require you to play skillfully in any capacity. Hitting an enemy puts them in a near-endless stun lock. Sometimes you can even do this with multiple enemies at once. It makes it so there's no reason to use any attacks outside of your main combo. This is made even worse when all enemies act and react in combat in almost a universal manner, and I don't feel that Kingdom Hearts falls into that trap. The way most enemies stagger when you hit them makes it feel like you're truly damaging them, and many enemies have abilities that can deflect a combo, or they'll fade away temporarily so you can't just keep them pinned down with a repetitive combo. There are also other enemies that must be approached in specific ways. The large body Heartless can only be damaged from behind unless you hit them with magic, and the elemental Heartless will be healed by their elements, so you have to be careful when choosing which magic to use against them. The green Requiem Heartless are dedicated specifically to healing their teammates, and they absorb all magical damage, so you have to rely on physical abilities to defeat them. Easily the best aspect of the combat system, which has been sadly neglected in every game since, is the tech point system. It encourages even more skillful play by giving the player experience points for proper blocking or attack deflection. There's enough enemy variety that the player will have to plan and adjust to specific encounters, which is more than can be said for a lot of the games in the genre. And this is why I chose the word deliberate to describe the game's combat. There's far more to it than meets the eye, despite Sora's relatively limited melee attack options, and you'll find yourself making use of these tools quite often, especially when combined with the abilities added to the final mix version of the game. The only exception is summons. Very few people tend to make use of the summons, and I can't blame them. I really didn't either, except during the super boss. While on the subject of game feel and control, even I must admit that Sora's main jump is less than ideal, but I also think that it's an incredibly overblown issue given that you can unlock the high jump and glide abilities later on. If you ever have trouble reaching a treasure chest, you can just come back for it after having gained these abilities. After all, thanks to the Trinity marks and the Dalmatian search, backtracking is baked into the core of the game's DNA. Even without those movement abilities, I felt a strong sense of accomplishment whenever I was able to get just that little bit of extra reach I needed from a jump by swinging my keyblade at the proper time. Some games have controls that are so bad that they cannot be adapted to, and while there is an argument to be had that having to adapt to controls in the first place is a problem, it is easily possible to adapt when it comes to jumping in Kingdom Hearts. The main complaint about the platforming outside of the controls is that if you miss a jump, you'll have to backtrack through long sections of level, and I call bullshit on this. It's a rare occurrence at best. For one, all of the levels are fairly small, and there are very few zones in which it'll take a long time to get anywhere, and more importantly, there are very few instances where the player will lose significant progress from missing a jump anyway. You could argue the vines and deep jungle and this tower in Halloween Town, but that's about it outside of Hollow Bastion, which is the penultimate level and should have some penalties for failure. Some people feel that the game would have been better off without platforming at all, and I wholeheartedly disagree. From the beginning days of Kingdom Hearts development, it was planned for the team to create a game that would have free-form movement in a 3D world, similar to Super Mario 64, and removing the ability to jump and by extension participate in platforming, the levels would have been heavily compromised and far less interesting to traverse. Speaking of which, I'm going to be talking about level design quite a bit throughout this retrospective. Actually, it may end up being a sticking point for most of my future videos since it's such an underserved aspect of game criticism, despite being one of the most important aspects of any video game, but it's doubly important for Kingdom Hearts, since as an action-adventure RPG hybrid, it determines everything from exploration to pacing. But the most interesting and often overlooked aspect that it affects is combat. I don't want to come off as condescending, but I tend to laugh at those who complain about falling off ledges in the first Kingdom Hearts because of combat. Of course you're gonna have trouble fighting flying enemies while on a precarious ledge if you attempt to jump at them. If only there was some sort of long-range option. One that I could use while remaining stationary so I don't fall off this ledge. Oh right, magic. I knew I was forgetting something, but oh no, what if I run out of MP? Well, I guess I could just use ethers or maybe avoid this particular combat if getting to my next destination is more important to me than getting experience points. Navigating and compensating for terrain is as much a part of the combat as striking your enemy is. Some bosses are even designed with this in mind. The second fight with the parasite cage has an acidic floor that will constantly drain your health when you touch it. The trickster forces you to make use of elevated surfaces so you consistently hit them. Fighting Jafar is based entirely around elevations and dodging. Okay, that last one could have definitely used some improvement, but the intention was clear to me at least. The towering Oogie Boogie fight is by far the most interesting example of this at play, integrating combat, terrain, platforming, and exploration all into one battle, and it's absolutely fantastic in its creativity. I enjoyed that the game forces the player to problem solve instead of allowing them to mash X at every opportunity. That's not to say that mashing X doesn't work in a lot of cases, but it feels like the very same people who complained about the first Kingdom Hearts simplicity are also the same people who complain when the game asks them to play skillfully or thoughtfully. At its best, the combat isn't so much about how you strike, but about how you will defend. And like everything else in the game, this lesson is taught almost immediately on Destiny Islands, where the Tidus and Riku fights focus on this mentality. It's about dodging, blocking, proper item usage, and looking for safe openings to attack more than it is about attacking itself.
Kind of like Dark Souls.
I find this focus on survival compelling, and the game's best bosses focus on this element more than any other. This is especially evident in the fights against humanoid enemies with a variety of strong attack options, something that many later games would also have a large focus on. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to them as duels for the duration of this video series. They may not technically be one-on-one, but they might as well be given the often less than efficient AI of your teammates and the fact that the game was focused more on the player's contributions to battle anyway. These duels encompass the most famous fights from the first game. Cloud, Dark Riku, Ansem, Sephiroth. These fights are considered the highlight of the game for many fans, and for good reason. They are the moments when the player truly gets to test their mastery of Sora's abilities. But even the bosses that are less mechanically satisfying are often still designed to test specific skills. Cerberus is your first real test of the dodge roll. Ursula tests your use of magic. Chernobog makes sure that you have a handle on the full 3D movement that flying provides before you reach the final battle. I've seen other critics argue that some of these fights are poorly designed because they require a specific tactic to be beaten, which just confuses me. Why would boss battles test you on specific skills? That's just stupid. It's much better when none of your bosses have unique mechanics so they all are defeated the exact same way. That's much better design. I'm mostly teasing. As much as I like that many of the bosses test the player on specific skills, there is truth to the fact that a lot of them are far too drawn out. Before replaying the game, I'd remembered the Ice Titan being an epic encounter, one that I was absolutely thrilled to finally conquer as a teenager, but during this playthrough, I found it mostly tedious. And I guess that's sort of my mentality overall. I admit that not every boss worked, but every boss encounter was still interesting in concept if nothing else, which is more than I can say for a lot of the future entries. But as much focus as combat gets in similar critiques of the game, I think it's important to remind players that it is not the game's sole focus. In fact, I'd argue that it's not even the game's primary focus. I'll point you back once again to Destiny Islands. What's the first thing you were tasked with doing? Fighting a bunch of enemies? No! You're tasked with exploring the island to find the materials for your raft. The game's primary focus is that word I oh so love to bring up in video game discussion: discovery. It's the main theme of the game's story, which is wholly about Sora's place in the world and how his life connects to others. It's integrated into item synthesis by hiding possible recipes until you've created previous ones. It's integrated into many of the boss fights by tasking the player with figuring out a solution as opposed to simply testing the player's reflexes. The gummy ship sections exist almost entirely to expand on this idea, by forcing you to spend a few slow minutes of space combat and traversal until a new world finally looms into view for the first time. This brings us to the game's most important and best element: its worlds. And I could say outright that the first Kingdom Hearts easily has the best designed worlds in the series. Forget player preference in regards to Disney nostalgia, I'm talking about the actual levels regardless of their coat of paint. I love the mini labyrinth of platforming that Agrabah provides, as well as the out-of-place treasure chests that taunt the player, teasing at the high jump and glide abilities they'll get later on. The Cave of Wonders is also fantastic. The obstacle course of water jets that can knock you down into the maze of caverns makes for some of the most interesting combat terrain in the entire game. And the caverns themselves hold a few interesting secrets as well. Wonderland was one of my least favorite worlds as a child because I found it so confusing to navigate, but now it's one of my favorites. The hunt for clues to clear your name during the trial, interacting with the bizarre room and its various perspective shifts and interactive elements, it's a joy. Monstro is a maze of portals and platforming that'll test the player's memory and combat restraint. Olympus Coliseum makes up for its lack of exploration by being an arena where you can fight a multitude of different monsters for numerous rewards. It remains my favorite arena level in the series, especially thanks to its time trial runs. While potentially an unpopular opinion, I really like Atlantica. The emphasis on movement in a 3D space gives traversal a wholly unique feel. It encourages magic use because of the added elevation, and it allows for a lot of large, wide open areas as well as cramped caverns to swim through to discover treasure. 100 Acre Wood offers a relaxing set of minigames that offer a great break from the more bombastic and combat-filled worlds. And of course, the non-Disney worlds are also well designed. Traverse Town is filled with secrets from the rooftops to the gizmo shop that make every return visit interesting, should you take the time to properly explore. The End of the World, while less mechanically interesting overall, is a fascinating bit of lore and presentation, almost awe-inspiring in its visual design and use of colors, and the numerous combat encounters are great for escalating tension on your way to the final boss. And of course, I couldn't make a proper critique of Kingdom Hearts without mentioning the wonder that is Hollow Bastion. If Destiny Islands is the setup, then Hollow Bastion is the absolutely beautiful payoff. The reincorporation is fantastic here. Sora being stripped of the Keyblade harkens back to Destiny Islands when he was forced to use a wooden sword against the Heartless to absolutely no effect. You are sent on yet another scavenger hunt, this time looking for pieces of a Heartless emblem to unlock a door. And this task in itself has several puzzles thrown in, at least one of which can be bypassed completely if you were thorough enough to unlock Glide before getting here. You are once again tasked with facing off against Riku one-on-one, which just so happens to be my favorite fight in the game, if not one of my favorites in the entire series. But it's not just reincorporation that the world does well. It contains some of the best examples of all the gameplay elements the title succeeds in. The floating platforms leading up to the castle are a great appetizer, and gliding around the outside of the castle entrance to find treasure chests is always a delight. There are multiple puzzles throughout the level. The maze of gates and bubble transports in the basement zones, the placing of library books to open secret passages. Some treasure chests themselves have been turned into mini logic puzzles, requiring you to discover that you must cast gravity on these hovering platforms to get access to them. And in terms of combat, you'll be faced with some of the strongest and most versatile enemy formations in the game, and in several cases you're forced to fight your way through them with no means of escape. Hollow Bastion is a masterpiece of game design. It is the best the series has ever been and likely ever will be. It alone makes the first game worth playing. As far as the remaining levels go, well, Halloween Town is admittedly slightly less remarkable to play through outside of the tower portion I keep raving about, which does take a decent chunk of the world's runtime. I'd say the only level that I really don't care for is Neverland. The confined rooms and lack of environmental detail inside the ship makes it annoying to navigate, but even then, getting to fly around outside the ship and the fight with Captain Hook were still very much worthwhile. Deep Jungle seems to be the most hated level in the game, if not one of the most hated in the series, but I don't think that the world itself is poorly designed. In fact, it can be quite interesting and really pushes the exploration element of the game. It most definitely fails with the placement and pacing of its story triggers though. But even the weaker worlds all have something unique baked into their core design outside of their visuals. Variety is the spice of life, and this game has it in spades. Kingdom Hearts to me, more than anything else, is about the following question. What will I find next? Which is something that has been diluted significantly in almost all the future titles, whether from reuse of worlds or just poorly designed ones. I hesitate to call future games dumbed down by comparison, but they're certainly far more concerned with making sure the player can't possibly miss anything. While future games do technically have levels that can be skipped, I can't imagine a scenario in Kingdom Hearts 2 or Birth by Sleep where a player could ever possibly be lost or stuck in the first place because of how straightforward the levels are. This is where I remind players that Kingdom Hearts was a game originally designed for children, and one of the things I like most about it is how it respects their intelligence. The game doesn't hold the player's hand. It's not afraid to let players fail or leave content incomplete. In fact, the first time I'd finished the game as a child, I left several worlds unfinished. I didn't find the keyhole in Wonderland, I didn't finish 100 Acre Wood, I certainly didn't have the patience to complete the maze that is Monstro, and yet the game let me continue on at my own pace anyway. It's a brilliant bit of design that I really miss, a willingness to let the player carve their own path, which is really a shame given that so many games are now open world and yet rarely provide the type of challenges that would stump or roadblock even the newest of players. These games are designed in such a way that discovery is the focus. If you were to get stuck somewhere, you could come back at any time, but instead they rely on scaling with your level or making every dungeon simple because they never know when the player is going to find them. I really can't stress enough how much I love this aspect of the first Kingdom Hearts and how much I wish other games would still allow for this kind of design. The only thing left to talk about is the story. And while I did lay out at the beginning of this video that story will have very little to do with my overall opinions of each title, to not discuss the story of the first Kingdom Hearts would be a disservice to the game, especially after pointing out that it does in fact fit the theming of the gameplay. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'll just make a note of a few things that really worked about Kingdom Hearts as a story. The Disney world set the standard for the series by mostly recreating the plots of specific Disney films, but with Sora's involvement in them. It's actually quite creative how they alter the story just enough to be familiar, while also truly integrating the Kingdom Hearts mythos. The villains of each movie are aware of the keyhole's existence, and they often have control over the Heartless. The 7 Princesses of Heart also fit naturally into the light versus darkness story without feeling too gimmicky. Maleficent, unsurprisingly, makes for a great antagonist, and her manipulation of Riku's own natural jealousy feels very plausible. Everything regarding the Paopu fruit really works for me. Riku explaining what sharing a Paopu fruit means, him dangling it as a reward above Sora's head for their race, the custom keychain for Oathkeeper that Kairi designs to look like a Paopu fruit, and then Sora drawing the sharing of the Paopu fruit in the cave only for Kairi to return the favor during the ending. It's fantastic. I love that it's revealed that Sora was never meant to be the Keyblade wielder in the first place, that Riku was truly the one whom was supposed to wield it. It works well with the underdog narrative, and it's a nice twist on the Chosen One trope. The Keyblade only went to Sora because of the strength of his friends, not because he was destined to be a hero. On that note, I love that Sora, Donald, and Goofy don't immediately become friends, that the other two only follow him because of their king's orders, actually abandoning him briefly in Hollow Bastion before deciding to side with him anyway because of all the time they've shared together. On the other end of the spectrum, arguably the weakest element of the story is Ansem himself, the mysterious figure whom acts as antagonist but only shows up towards the end of the game. He's not all that interesting unless you read his reports, but that's okay, because Ansem isn't the focus of the story. The focus of the story is Sora coming of age in a search for his friends, which is why it's so heartbreaking when, after all the struggle, Kairi and Riku are both ripped away from him once more. It is powerfully bittersweet and quite brave for a game that was created in partnership with Disney that had no guarantee of a sequel at that time. Once again, I have to give credit to the game for taking children seriously and not just pandering to them with a happily ever after. I loved this ending the first time I completed the game as a child, and it still hits home now, even as a jaded adult. Kingdom Hearts is one of the most fully realized titles I've ever had the joy of playing. It's a grand adventure that entails everything an adventure ought to entail, not just in terms of its narrative, but also in terms of gameplay. It doesn't just test one's reactions, it also tests one's mind. It rewards the curious consistently while never holding the player's hand. The only thing holding the first Kingdom Hearts back even remotely is its release date. Being an early PS2 title when 3D games are still struggling to truly become, well, good, has made the title show its age, even if only just. Seriously, for those whom are like me and grew up on the PS1 and 2, try going back to some of these games. There are many concessions that have to be made to truly enjoy them. You have to resign yourself to the fact that they're going to be either stiff or floaty. You have a good chance the camera is just not going to work. But even with those issues in mind, Kingdom Hearts still holds up better than most of the other games of the era, and even many that have come after. In fact, even attempts made by the same company have routinely failed to capture the same magic. This is where I spoil pretty much every future video in this series by saying that the original Kingdom Hearts, at least the final mixed version of the game, is, in my opinion, the best game in the entire series. I'll be the first to admit that not everything worked, but everything was interesting, and I'd rather play something interesting that stumbles here and there in its execution than something that is really polished but ultimately repetitive and boring. It may not be as refined as future titles, but it also takes far more risks than future titles. All in all, Kingdom Hearts is a fantastic start to a mostly great series.